What if I asked you to envision the political party that opposes your own? To think about a political figure which represents that party? What if I asked you to debate them with little to no preparation in an attempt to convert them to your own viewpoint? How would you go about doing so? To begin, I would discredit the pillars upon which my opposing party stands. As a Democrat, my opposing party is the Republican Party. And so if my opponent was Republican, I would attack their viewpoints on abortion, immigration, gun control, things like that. I would then establish the correctness or rightness of my own views on those subjects to convince the opponent why my views are correct. If neither of those things worked, I would resort to discrediting or undermining the opposing party. This last action is actually known as ad hominem, or attacking a person rather than what they say. This is an example of a poor listening technique. A poor listening technique which is known as aggressive listening. There can be severe consequences to this tactic, especially within a community, as will be explained later in the speech. It's important to know about these poor listening techniques so that you can recognize when they are occurring and teach yourself to avoid them, and in turn avoiding the consequences that may result from them. The objective of the speech will be to describe these listening techniques, these poor listening techniques, and to show the consequences that can arise from them in hopes of getting you to avoid engaging in them. The speech will progress as follows. To begin, I will explain what aggressive listening is. I will then provide an example of it, specifically from the Democratic Party. I will then list the consequences of that action and the effect it had on the cohesion of the Democratic Party, both internally and as perceived externally. Aggressive listening occurs when a listener in a conversation listens only to respond to a person by attacking them. This means rather than listening to what a person says and responding to that response, a person instead attacks the identity or personality of their opponent. An example of this is when former Vice President and Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden stated that if you are essentially struggling to vote either him or Trump, if that decision is a struggle for you, then you aren't Black. This is an example of aggressive listening. The Black interviewer who stated to Joe that he had further questions for him and was met with that response had an adverse reaction to it. He believed, and several other figures believed, that Joe Biden was questioning the identity of Black supporters who supported President Trump and the Republican Party. Rather than listening to the questions the Black interviewer wanted to pose, Joe Biden instead decided to question the authenticity of the identity of Black supporters who were against him. This technique of aggressive listening had some very severe consequences from Republicans and Democrats alike. For example, Tim Scott, a Black Republican senator, stated, and I quote, "The comment was the most arrogant, condescending comment he'd heard in a very long time." Other Republican responses included, Who the heck does he think he is? And truly offensive. This shows how external sources, such as Republican figures, viewed Joe Biden's comment and subsequently viewed the Democratic Party. Joe Biden made a comment that was dividing. And so it put into question the cohesion and unity of the Democratic Party as perceived from people outside of the party. Joe Biden's loyalty to his Black supporters was questioned by people outside of the party. And so a division became apparent. And the cohesion of this community came into question. The response from Democratic figures, such as Roderica Applewhite, a former Democrat campaign worker, stated that this is so embarrassing and hurtful, I don't even know where to begin. Other comments from Democrats echoed the same sentiment. This shows that Joe Biden's comment caused disharmony within the Democratic Party, especially among his Black supporters, who detested his comment about the authenticity of Black supporters who supported Trump. All of these consequences could have been avoided had the former vice president been aware of his tendency of poor listening practices and had known to avoid them. So, knowing these practices and knowing how to avoid them is extremely beneficial. Whether you're a president, whether you're a presidential candidate on a world stage, or whether you're a normal person debating a topic with a friend. Being aware of these poor listening practices and their consequences can make you a much better listener and a much better debater.